I don't think there's anyone that doesn't know about the Arabian Nights. It is a book that was translated from Arabic by Sir Richard Francis Burton in the 1800s. I am highlighting it because of the blatant racism that was in the book from the beginning. So, who was Sir Richard Francis Burton? He was a gifted linguist, a daring explorer, and a prolific author. He was forced to leave Oxford for unruly behavior. From there, he joined the British Army in India, where he gained a remarkable knowledge of Arabic, Hindustan, and Persian, eventually acquiring 29 languages and many dialects. He led the famed expedition to discover the source of the Nile and, disguised as a Muslim, he made the pilgrimage to Mecca, then a forbidden pilgrimage to non Muslims. And he entered the sacred city of Harare in uncharted East Africa. So, this Harare is in Ethiopia. Burton translated versions of many famous texts, including the Kama Sutra and the Arabian Nights, which is perhaps his most celebrated achievement. So, this is one of the most interesting introductions I've ever come across in terms of a book and how it explains the context around which the Arabian Nights was translated. So, you'll find that the Arabic people were not racist, but the Europeans were. So, Burton had to translate in such a way that it made the book racist. And it was one of the most popular books, excluding, aside from the Bible, for almost 300 years. So they were teaching racism to children from a very young age because the Arabian Nights was read by mainly children. The introduction. The story of the book called The Arabian Nights, it has been said, is a story worthy of being in the Arabian Nights. 3 centuries have passed since the publication of the first European translation of the book, whose Arabic title translates to The Thousand and One Nights. The appearance of the work in Europe divides the story into 2 chapters. The first chapter is a dimly known tale. It is the history of the medieval Arabic work. A glimpse of the book is caught, and then centuries pass. The second chapter is a much better known tale and is also exceedingly complicated. It is the history of the modern work, or works, I should say, that the title Arabian Nights now refers mainly to many works. It is a tale with surprising twists and a gallery of characters, adventurers, scholars, eccentrics, rogues. Indeed, the translator of these stories in this volume was all of those things. Here I may do no more than mention what is most essential and notable in that long story. Our knowledge of the development of the medieval work is sketchy, and there are 2 versions of it. The first might be called the consensus version, and the second the minority report. The earliest evidence of the book is in the 9th century papyrus found in Egypt. The papyrus bears the title The Book of the Tale of the Thousand Nights, and it contains the beginning of an early version of the framed tale. In it, a slave girl, Dinazad, asks her mistress, Sherazad, to tell a pleasant story to pass the night. Their names are Persian, and the 10th century historian Al Masaudi tells us in this story the medals of gold of a book called Al Layla, A Thousand Nights, was an Arabic translation of a Persian work, the Ha Asfani, or Thousand Tales. Masaudi says that it is a collection of stories translated from Persian, Indian, Greek, and many other sources. And he mentions a framed tale about a king, his minister, the minister's daughter, and her slave. Later in the 10th century, the bibliographer Ibn al Nadim, excuse the pronunciations, mentions the book near the end of his vast bibliography. He describes the framed tale in what in somewhat more detail than al-Masaudi. He tells us that the king would marry a woman and kill her in the morning until he married the daughter of his minister, a woman named Scheherazade, who tricked him into letting her live by telling him a story that she left unfinished at dawn. This went on for 1,001 nights, during which Scheherazade bore him a son who then decided to keep her alive. It is Ibn al Nadim who concludes a vulgar work written in bad style from the 12th century, a lone record from a Jewish bookseller in Cairo mentions the book titled The 1,001 Nights. The 15th century Egyptian historian al Makrizi quotes 13th century Spanish Arabic sources who claim the book circulated in Cairo in the time of the Fatimid dynasty and later the 11th century. On the basis of these facts and the internal evidence of the stories themselves, there is general agreement that an Arabic translation of the Persian story collection forms the core of the 1,001 Nights. The Persian collection itself probably began as a translation of an Indian collection. The device of a framed tale in itself is considered an Indian literary device. So a framed tale is the main story surrounded by different stories within the context of one story. Apart from that single tantalizing fragment in the 9th century papyrus, the earliest surviving manuscript for the Arabian Nights dates back from the 14th century. If we compare the beginning of the framed tale in that manuscript with the 9th century version, we see that the slave and the mistress become sisters, and the title of the work becomes The 1,001 Nights. The usual course has been to posit a Baghdad layer of stories being added to the translation, and then later another layer of stories were added from Cairo, possibly Damascus. Also, there was the source of additional tales. In this view, the book grew slowly over the course of 6 or 7 centuries until the late medieval period, say the 14th or 15th century. There existed a work similar to the modern Arabic editions, first printed in Egypt and India in the 19th century, known as the Bulak, and the second Calcutta editions. There is, as is said, a revisionist view put forth by Mushin Mahdi. Mahdi has argued that the late medieval work was much smaller than the versions in the Egyptian manuscripts used to make the Bulak and Calcutta editions. It is, in this view, perhaps a quarter of a length of the 19th century Arabic editions. Most of the stories found in those editions, Mahdi argues, were added in response to the European demand for more stories, to a shorter and more coherent Syrian work. Okay, so now we get to the juicy bit. The modern history of the Knights, the modern Knights, begins in 1704 with Antoine Galland's translation into French of a three and possibly four-volume Arabic manuscript sent to him in Paris. Galland had spent some years in Istanbul, where he was attached to the French embassy to the Ottoman court as a translator of Oriental languages, Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. The manuscript of the Thousand and One Nights sent to him in Paris was of Syrian origin, and in 1704 he brought out the first two volumes of his translation, Le Mille et Une Nuit. They were an immediate popular success, and soon cheap translations of his translations were made into other European languages. To Galland belongs much of the credit for the success of the Knights in all the various forms in Western literature. To comprehend how he shaped the translation, it must be understood that our concept of what translation is differs from the prevalent view in Galland's era, and indeed from the concept of translation that would hold sway a century later. Galland treated his Arabic manuscript sources with considerable freedom, and in three ways his changes were critical to the work's subsequent success. First, he bowdlerized the text. Second, he made other changes in the stories that he felt were necessary for the literary tastes of the time. And third, it seems he inserted Arabic stories not found in his manuscripts. Some of the most famous stories in European editions of the Nights are so called orphan stories, stories that appeared in Galland's translation, for which no Arabic manuscript version has been found. The most outstanding examples are Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves. All of these things, but especially his censorship of racy episodes, paved the way for numerous children's adaptations of stories that would appear for the next 2 centuries. The influence of the children's editions can hardly be overestimated. For at least the next 2 centuries, probably the only work that exercised greater influence on European literature was the Bible. For numerous European and American writers, a childhood reading of these stories from the Arabian Nights was their first experience of the power of imaginative literature. The popular success of Galland's translation notwithstanding, it was only in the later part of the 18th century that other Arabists would take note and begin to delve into its medieval Arabic sources. And then Galland's translation was also decisive in rather a different way. Study of Galland's work and the three-volume manuscript in the Bibliothèque Nationale of France suggests that he also worked on another manuscript now lost. The three-volume manuscript also may be missing a fourth volume. What is more, at a certain point in his translation, Galland abandoned the device of the divisions into nights. Volume 6 concluded on night 236, and volume 7 begins with the justification for dropping the device. As a result of doubts would ultimately arise as to whether he translated the entirety of the Arabic work. In 1776, an English scholar, for example, would claim that Galland's translation covered only about half the stories in the Arabic versions. As a result of our assortment of scholars, adventurers, rogues, they began searching for the rest of the stories, and they found them, or at least they found more stories. The stories whose inclusion in the Nights is disputed by Mahdi. Be that as it may, The results of the new interests were twofold. The first printed Arabic editions were made, and new translations were based on these Arabic editions. Between the years 1814 and 1818, the first printed Arabic edition of the Nights was published in Calcutta under the supervision of the College of Fort William, which had been established by the British colonial government in India. But it was an incomplete edition containing only 200 nights and the story of Sinbad. Then in 1835, the completed edition of the in Arabic, an edition divided into 1001 nights, was printed in Cairo. This is known as the Bulak edition, Bulak being the district in Cairo where the first printing press in the Arabic world had been established by the ruler of Egypt, Muhammad Ali. Then between 1839 and 1842, another complete edition of the Nights was published in Calcutta, now known as the second edition. It was largely based on the Bulak edition. Bulak and Calcutta second would serve as the sources of the subsequent European translations. Of these translations, two in English that preceded Burton's must be mentioned, those of Edward Lane and John Payne. Lane was an Orientalist scholar who resided many years in Cairo. He is remembered today for three works: his English Arabic lexicon, unfinished at his death, a classic account of contemporary Egyptian society called The Manners and Customs of Modern Egyptians, and his translation of the Nights between the years 1838 and 1841. Lane published his translation of the Nights based on the Bulak edition, in which he attacked Gallen's work in his preface. He said, "I assert that Galland has extensively or excessively perverted the work. His acquaintance with Arabic manners and customs was insufficient to preserve him always from errors of the grossest description. Unfortunately, Lane himself took a number of freedoms with the text. The son of an Anglican clergyman, he was thoroughly Victorian in his morals, and he too censored the Bulak text. So his work was no advance on Gallen's in that respect. What is perhaps worse is that he left out those stories he considered inferior, only providing summaries of them in his notes. And he also left out the most of the poetry found in the Bulak edition, since he considered it inferior." So they are stealing work from Arabic texts, and they are judging it as inferior to English or European civility. Much of it is mediocre, he claims. Then around 1876, John Payne began an English translation based on the Calcutta 2 text. Payne was what today would be called an independent scholar. Besides learning a number of European languages, he also taught himself Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. His translation was not heavily censored like Lane's, but he had a weakness for archaic English words and expressions, which found their way into his translation. Those who, like Lane's translation, attacked Payne's, and it was their barrage of criticism that attracted the attention of Richard Burton, then languishing in a British consul in Trieste. Even among the colorful cast of characters drawn to the Nights, Burton stands out. Although Burton reused a good deal of Payne's translations with Payne's permission, because Burton was in a hurry, he was always in a hurry. It seems he clearly superseded Payne's by translating everything. That is of chief value. Its greatest drawbacks, however, are the racist descriptions with which he embellished certain stories. the framed tale most prominently, and the fact that his prose is quite difficult to read. There are many styles of Arabic found in the Calcutta too, and one would expect a book composed of different hands, but in general, the prose style of the Arabic is fairly plain, especially when compared with other medieval Arabic prose texts. The editors of the Calcutta II and Bulak fixed most of the colloquial Arabic, although in the various manuscripts of the Nights, though not all of it. But Burton's language has nothing to do with any of it. It is simply his own bizarre concoction, hence the great value of Zipf's translation. The story of the Nights is the story of a marginalized medieval Arabic work that, in its modern guises, conquers the world. Gallen's publication of his first two volumes in 1704 pulled together the stopper of the bottle and the Jinneh in the Nights. Like a shape shifting Jinneh, the Nights would henceforth take different guises, and through them it would adapt itself to literary tastes all around the world. It is a sort of story that, as as the recurrent phase has it, could be written in the letters of gold on the inner corner of the eye. The Arabian Nights has become one of the most essential texts that is sometimes called world literature. Long before Coca Cola and Mickey Mouse, there was the Arabian Nights, which conquered the world market. Um, as prolific as the Arabian Nights is to literature, it needs to be taken into consideration that it did promulgate a lot of racism against Black people. And there was very little sympathy for Black slavery and in society at the time. And it should be noted that there was slavery in Arabic society, but it was not as racialized as it was in European society. And they edited the Bulak and Calcutta scripts in such a way that it made Arabic people more racist. So, as children, people would read the book and internalize racism, and it is said that it was as prolific as the Bible, second only to the Bible. And they were giving this book to children to read, perpetuating this cycle of racism from generation to generation. And this book was written in 1704, translated from Arabic to French in 1704. And the amount of racism that is in the book is staggering. And it's racism against Black people, racism against Arabic people, and it's also racism against Jewish people. It also needs to be noted that they didn't credit a lot of Arabic people with the origin of the story. Burton is mentioned, Galland is mentioned, Payne is mentioned, Zipes is mentioned. These are all Europeans that didn't originate the story and yet benefited from Arabic texts. So, in terms of reparations, I believe that the Arabic world or the Arabic community is owed some form of compensation because this is the stealing of their culture and the stealing and the bastardization of their culture. So the stories reveal racist prejudices not only regarding Black people, but also in respect to Jewish people, Persians, and Europeans. The popularization of the Arabian Nights coincided with the industrialization of slavery. For you to industrialize slavery, it means you need to dehumanize the people that you want to enslave. So, black people were savages and needed to be civilized. And they were akin to animals, and you can't treat people badly if you value them. So, I'm noticing that they needed to indoctrinate children to view fellow human beings as less than them in order for them to take advantage of them. And the industrialization of slavery occurred in the from the 1800s to the 1900s. And when I speak of the industrialization of slavery, I'm referring to the intensification and the expansion of enslavement, along with the growth of the industrial capitalism, particularly in the late 18th and 19th centuries, of which this book, The Arabian Nights, was popularized in 1704, and for 3 centuries was the most popular book in second only to the Bible. While slavery existed or pre existed industrialization of slavery, it was fueled and transformed by the Industrial Revolution, where there was a demand for raw materials like cotton, sugar, and tobacco. This led to a significant increase in the demand for enslaved labor to produce these goods, making the practice more widespread and more exploitative. So, regions became heavily reliant on enslaved labor, such as the American South, where I believe it was Mark Twain who read the Arabian Nights and was heavily influenced by it. Just taking an extract from Slavery and the British Industrial Revolution by Heblik Redding and Voth. They asked the question: was Europe's rise to riches built on the blood, sweat, toil, and death of enslaved peoples? Europeans enslaved millions of men and women on the African continent during the colonization of the Americas. Those who survived the transatlantic voyage were forced to labor on sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee plantations in the Caribbean and in North and South America. In the process, Europeans accumulated vast wealth, either from the slave trade itself, or from plantation productions, or from the wider triangular trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Growth in Europe took off during the century when the slave trade and overseas slavery in European colonies reached its greatest scale. So, to what extent did slavery wealth contribute to the growth and economic development of modern Europe? The idea that slavery and the trade of enslaved human beings jump-started the Industrial Revolution is almost as old as economics itself. Smith famously saw slavery as inherently inefficient and believed that Britain's colonial possessions in the West Indies drained the nation's resources, while Marx, or Karl Marx, on the other hand, argued that modern industrial capitalism was built on the capital accumulation facilitated by slavery. The veiled slavery of the wage workers in Europe was needed, and its pedestal, pure slavery, and simple in the New World. Capital comes from dripping from head to foot for every pore with the blood and dirt. I don't know what that means. So basically, there's a denialism in regards to the contributions of the industrialization of slavery. Yet, if they hadn't industrialized slavery, I don't believe that Europe would have developed to the extent that it developed and accumulated as much wealth as it has accumulated. And you wouldn't find as many European countries still invested in Africa to this day. You find they're invested in Africa, yet they do not develop Africa nor put back anything into African nations. In fact, they destabilize a lot of African sovereignty. And a good example of this is, have you noticed that no Europeans have been sent to The Hague? Yet majority of the people that are prosecuted and imprisoned in The Hague are from Africa or African despots. That's a bit strange. Back to the article. In the recent work by Heblik in 2022, they examined geographically disaggregated data on the impact of slavery and the wealth development. To do so, they collected and used data on the geography of slaveholding and economic development in Britain. So, this is specific to Britain. They combined these with a new source of exogenous variation in slavery wealth and quantitative spatial model to measure wealth from slave holding. They used a unique data source through the Abolition of Slavery Act in 1833, which provided compensation payment to existing slaveholders. So they were compensating slaveholders and not the slaves. So, how do slaves get out of the cycle of poverty if they're not compensated and they're further exploited after the abolition of slavery? It never made any sense to me. Anyway, these compensation payments were substantial and equal to 20 million in historical prices, equivalent to around 40% of the government's budget and 5% of the gross domestic product. In today's money, this is the equivalent to from 2 to 108 billion. They use the individual data plan on these compensation payments to more than 25,000 slaveholders, as compiled by historians over more than a decade in the legacies of British slavery databases. This allowed them to directly measure slavery wealth for each slaveholder in terms of the total number of enslaved persons and their assessed value. That's tragic. And to locate these slaveholders geographically, they combined a measure of the slaveholder wealth drawn from claims of compensation with detailed information on the population, employment structure, and property values. Taken together, their findings suggest two important conclusions. First, the involvement of the slave trade and wealth derived from slaveholding had an important effect on the geography of economic development during the British Industrial Revolution, while the sudden reordering of economic prominence in the period after 1750 has long seemed puzzling. Our evidence offers a clear explanation for why some locations suddenly took off economically. Second, our results strongly suggest that Marx was right. Slavery wealth accelerated Britain's industrial revolution. Well, duh. So there's a denialism in regards to the contribution of the industrialization and exploitation of Black bodies in the Americas and for the British colonies. And then there is a denialism in regards to the current exploitation of Africa and its contribution to the development of Europe. And yet, even their own findings are showing that there is the exploitation of there's the benefit of from the exploitation of Africa and Africans overall. It should be noted that these countries have not paid reparations to any African country. So the question becomes, why does Europe refuse to pay reparations? And the explanation that I found is that Europe has a reluctance to pay reparations, which stems from a complex mix of legal, political, and historical factors. I wonder what the historical factors are. Some European nations, like Germany, have historically struggled with the concept of reparations after World War One, seeing them as a form of national humiliation. So what? The Treaty of Versailles, which demanded reparations from Germany, led to economic hardship and hyperinflation. Comes with the territory. Other European countries, particularly those with colonial histories, have been hesitant to acknowledge the moral responsibility for injustices committed during colonialism, fearing it could set legal precedents for future claims. That comes with the territory. You need to pay for the damage done, and you need to facilitate development in the countries that were exploited because they're currently suffering without the resources that would have facilitated development. Some argue that reparations are not a matter of financial transfer, but rather encompass non financial forms such as redress, apologies, reconciliation, and the acknowledgement of historical wrongdoings. Of course, there are historical wrongdoings, and that acknowledgement humanizes people that these were human beings that were treated like animals and utensils. Furthermore, there are debates over which entity should be responsible for reparations. If you can form the Hague to prosecute African despot leaders, you can form a council responsible for reparations, especially to Africa and to African Americans. And there should be historic redress in retrospect for historical wrongdoings. Anyway, in some instances, the Soviet Union's influence on reparations agreements has also led to ongoing disputes and questions about their validity. Ultimately, the reluctance to pay reparations reflects a broader struggle to reconcile the historical wrongs of colonialism with the war of modern and legal realities. That's neither here nor there. If Germany can pay reparations to Israel for World War II and the atrocities that were committed there, Africa deserves reparations from Europe, and there is enough money and resources to facilitate reparations to Africa and to facilitate development in Africa and universal development. So I mentioned earlier that Germany had to pay reparations to Jewish people and Holocaust victims, and that totaled 86 billion between 1945 and 2018 and continues today. These reparations cover a variety of issues, including restitution for lost property, compensation for suffering and losses due to Nazi persecution, and ongoing support for survivors and their families. If there is that much guilt by the Germans, there should be just as much guilt by Belgium in terms of what was done to the Belgium Congo, where 20 upwards up to 20 million people were massacred by due to Belgium's mandates for rubber. So, what does this have to do with the Arabian Nights? Basically, when you indoctrinate people from a young age to devalue and dehumanize people of color, it leads to their oppression, subjugation, and exploitation in perpetuity. So, while the Arabian Nights did not directly cause the industrialization of slavery, it did have a cultural impact in the West, where it was translated and widely read, and can be viewed in the context of the broader cultural landscape during the industrialization of slavery. It also can be included in regards to the treatment of slaves and race in general. The Arabian Nights, in the historical context, which was a study, notes that the genie in the lamp, initially depicted as an um, Asian figure, was later transformed into a racialized character of an African slave in retellings, highlighting the complex relationship between cultural representations and the racialized realities of slavery. It's also important to note that while slavery was a global phenomenon with diverse roots, the industrialization of slavery, particularly in the context of the transatlantic slave trade, was driven by the demands of the Industrial Revolution and the rise of capitalism. So, the primary driving force behind the industrialization of slavery was the economic demand for free labor and profits from industries such as cotton, which were directly linked to the Industrial Revolution. I really don't like this word Oriental, but it's coming up in this article from Nussbaum or Nussbaum, excuse the pronunciation. And it deals with slavery, blackness, and Islam, the Arabian Nights in the 18th century. So he states, or they state, the abolition movement and Orientalism, or more generally imperialism, are frequently yoked together as contemporaneous signs of modernity and seldom as objects of analysis. The year 2007 marks the anniversary of two seemingly disparate events. It commemorates the abolition of Slavery Act of 1807, while it comes roughly 300 years after the French and English translation of the Arabian Nights entertainments. How we ask, does the slave trade in the 18th century relate to the translation of the Oriental tales into languages of the two major European imperialist forces? The subject of the abolition is, in large part, the black from sub Saharan Africa, while subject to Orientalism inhabits the East Indies, China, and Levant and the Barbary Coast. The two geographical regions serve as different imaginative purposes for Europe. Sub Saharan Africa, in most often represented lucrative source of slaves rather than as a threat to the polity of England and France, while the Islamic world perceived as more potent, even in decline, offered an alluring model of the empire with menacing eschatology, apparently wrote Robert Burton in his 1885 preface for the Arabian Nights in England, as ever forgetting that she is at present the greatest Mohammedan empire in the world. Written by Burton. Um, what does that mean? It means that yes, there was slavery in the Orient, but it wasn't as prolific as the industrialization of slavery. So we've dealt with how the Arabian Nights introduced slavery to European children who became slaveholders themselves and justified slavery for economic advancements, to how the industrialization of slavery was denied by Europe when it comes to paying reparations to Africa and within America to the previously or descendants of the enslaved. It should be noted that when reparations are paid to Black people, and this is taking into consideration Germany paying the Namakwa and Herero people in Namibia, they will be the Jewish people were compensated over almost 90 billion. The Herero and Namakwa people are going to be compensated 1.1 billion euros over the next 30 years. That's peanuts in comparison to what the Jewish people got. And in America, for reparations, each slave was promised 40 acres and a mule. So, how much is 40 acres and a mule today? New York Sun says that it is worth about $560,000, and the mule is worth about 43,000. So that comes to approximately 640 billion to the descendants of the previously enslaved. What is the American GDP? It's almost 30 trillion. So America has the capacity to pay reparations to the previously enslaved. They just choose not to. So the question comes, why does America not pay reparations to the previously enslaved? And it says the US hasn't paid reparations to the descendants of the previously enslaved people primarily due to a combination of legal, political, and social factors. In terms of legal limitations, many state and federal laws under which the individuals can sue for damages have statutes of limitations. That's extremely unfair, which have long since passed. This makes it difficult to pursue legal claims for reparations under existing laws. The second thing is political opposition. There is a significant political opposition to reparations, particularly from Republicans and conservatives. Many believe that current generations should not be held responsible for the actions of the previous generations and that reparations would be unfair to taxpayers. That doesn't make any sense considering they're currently benefiting from the work of the enslaved peoples. Then there are social and economic factors. Some argue that closing the racial wealth gap through reparations would be impossible to implement and would require placing a monetary value on the long term effects of slavery, which is considered difficult to quantify. I it's with this in mind that I bring us back to the fact that the Jewish people were paid about 90 billion for the atrocities committed during um, World War II. And there are, I believe, about 44 million Black Americans, and they would be entitled to 640 billion. That comes to 500,000, around 500,000 to 600,000 per person. Whereas for Jewish people and 6 million Jewish people that were um, for 250 years of slavery. $59 actually per year. Per year. And for Jewish people, that comes to about 2,500 for each year. So these countries have the capacity to pay people, the descendants of the previously enslaved, and they're choosing not to. And slavery historically required dehumanization, which involved the outright denial of someone's humanity, such as in claims of groups of enslaved people who are not fully human. It can also portray them as less than human. And this also occurs through the objectification of women and the demonization of migrants. What am I trying to say? There is it stems off initially from the psychological um, objectification of black bodies, which is promulgated by literature, bastardization of literature like the Arabian Nights. From there, once you dehumanize people, you can utilize them as utensils for free labor. Because they're not human, then they don't need compensation for their work. So you can treat them however you want to treat them and benefit substantially from the loss of income of these people. There are no overhead costs, and it's just pure profit. So that translates to 250 years of the dehumanization of Black people. And that dehumanization extends into the lack of reparations for these people. A good example of reparations being paid is Haiti. Haiti was required to pay, I believe, the equivalent of 130 billion to France in these times, which destroyed the economy. And France went on to make trade agreements with places like the US and the rest of Europe that prevented Haiti from trading sugarcane. It was a brilliant economy prior to France destroying the economy. And France has never paid reparations to Haiti, yet Haiti paid reparations to France. And to this day, when there are natural disasters in Haiti, France doesn't come in and assist the people. And yet, Haiti is a former French colony. America goes in and assists Haiti. And just a little anecdote from Haiti is that I believe basically in 2010, there was an earthquake in Haiti, and the American Red Cross raised nearly 500 million in donations for Haiti. But the issue is that that 500 million built approximately six houses by 2018, and the that money has gone. It's had initial plans to construct about 700 houses, which is which in itself is a lie, because you can build over because that would mean that each house costs about 720,000 to build, of which um, you can build houses for $50,000 each. That's about 10,000 houses housing about maybe 5 people. That would come to about 50,000 people assisted by the Red Cross. So they're saying that there was an investigation by Pro Republic and the NPR, which revealed concerns about the Red Cross's response, including poorly managed projects and questionable spending and a lack of transparency. Um, the Red Cross responded to the criticism, stating that their spending is justifiable and they are accountable to their donors. And yet they never accounted for whatever happened to that money. And that money was supposed to go to Haiti, but to this day, those Haitians are still living in tents and have not benefited from the money that was raised for them. In other words, that money didn't leave America. It's still benefiting the Red Cross in America. So back to the Arabian Nights that credits the Europeans without crediting the Arabic people, the Arabic and the Persian people that came up with the actual stories. And it speaks of how the Europeans plagiarized each other's works, and they don't speak of how they plagiarized and credited each other for the work, um, which is it's wrong. And the Arabic people have never been compensated for the loss of income from their heritage. Anyway, Burton's Arabian Nights is generally recognized as one of the finest unexpurgated translations of William Hayes' Calcutta 2 edition. The fact is, however, that Burton plagiarized a good deal of his translation from John Payne's book, the Book of the Thousand Nights and One, so that he could publish the book quickly and acquire the private subscribers to Payne's edition. Payne, a remarkable translator and scholar of independent means, had printed only 500 copies of his excellent unexpurgated edition, for he did not expect that much of a demand for the expensive 9 volume set. However, there were 1,000 more subscribers who wanted his work, and since Payne was indifferent with regards to publishing a second edition, Burton received Payne's permission to offer the new translation and for these subscribers about a year after Payne's work first appeared. Moreover, Burton profited a great deal from Payne's spade work. That is not to say that Burton's translation, which has copious anthropological notes as and an important terminal essay, should not be considered his work. He did most of the translation by himself, and only toward the end of the 10 volumes does he plagiarize. Although he kept his own style and apparently referred to the original text with regards to questions of interpretation. In contrast to Payne, Burton was more meticulous in respecting the word order and the exact phrasing of the original. He included the division into nights with the constant intervention of Scheherazade, and was more competent in translating the verse. Moreover, he was more insistent on emphasizing the erotic and bawdy aspects of the nights, as he remarked in his introduction that the object was to show what the thousand nights and a night really is, not, however, for reasons to be more fully stated in the terminal essay by restraining verbum redre verbo, but by writing as the Arab would have written in English. The result was a quaint, even bizarre, and somewhat stilted English that makes for difficult reading today. Even in his own day, his language was obsolete, archaic, and convoluted. Therefore, I have to endeavor to rework Burton's accurate and difficult translation into a more modern English idiom while trying to retain the flavor of his original and some of his stock phrases and mannerisms. So it's basically Europeans translating Europeans without sticking to the originality of the text, the Arabic text. My small selection of tales from Burton's comprehensive 10 volumes and his publications of supplemental tales has been made with an eye towards representing the various types of narratives that are in the larger collection: the fairy tale, the parable, and the didactic tale, the fable, the legend, the jest, and the anecdote, and the apocryphal tale. The two famous tales, Aladdin and the Magic Lamp and Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, did not appear in Burton's original collection of the Nights, but in his supplementary edition. His translation of Aladdin and the Magic Lamp was based on the Arabic manuscript published first in France under the Histoire d'Aladdin ou La Lampe Marveleuse, texte arabe, edited by Herman Zottenberg, and the translation of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves was based on a 19th century Hindustan version of Hazar Dastan, The Thousand Tales, by Totaram Shayan. Most of my selections are well known. Others have been, in my opinion, unduly neglected. They are all included within the framework of Scheherazad's narrative that lends the collection its special meaning and charm, which I hope I have managed to convey. Um, that's all well and good, but it's still not true to the Arabic text. And it's again, in reading the Thousand One Nights, you notice there is a lot of racism in the book, and it is a book that's meant for children. And if children are growing up with an inherent racism, it makes it difficult for them to turn into adults with open minds and with an eye towards um, restitution and resolving the wrongs of their forefathers. The Arabian Nights is popular even to this day, and it permeates how people treat each other, especially treating people of color. Um, and it's the juxtaposition between children need to learn how to read, and children need to have what's it to have an appreciation of literature and their heritage, and just an appreciation of literature, but in the same regard, what are they reading, what are they learning, and how are they learning to treat people? There is the example of the black doll versus the white doll. And if you take into consideration that children are reading the Arabian Nights prior to being examined on such, um, experimented on in regards to the dolls, they're obviously going to pick the pale doll. In the Arabian Nights, the paler you are, the better you are, the more special you are, the more superior you are, and the higher your rank. And the darker you are, the more the more impoverished you are, and the less sympathy there is towards your circumstances, your situation, and whether or not you have a disability in the text. Um, I can give many examples because I have read the book and I quite enjoyed it. It's just that as I was reading it, I realized that there's a lot of racism in this book. A good example is in the story of Shaharia and his brother. Um, he finds his wife sleeping with the black slave. And if there is a slave mistress situation, you realize that the slave has no choice. Yet the slave is decapitated by the king, and the queen is also decapitated by the king. However, given the power dynamic, you would think that the slave would be absolved of the wrong, but there's no sympathy and there's no pity because the slave is dark black and ugly. And there's a lot of dark black ugly people in the book of the Arabian Nights, and there is no depiction of dark black people as beautiful in the entirety of the book. And this is an indication of the dehumanization and the racism that was rampant during that time, and how it fed into the culture of the people and how they treated people of color. Okay, there's this um, just I'm going to just take a little portion of how black people are described. All of a sudden, a big slobbering black Moor with eyes rolling leapt from the trees. It was truly a hideous sight. If it was a hideous sight, why would this beautiful pale queen want this black slobbering mass with rolling eyes um, to come to her? And it should be noted that in the tales of the 101 Arabian Nights, there's a lot of interracial relationships, which means that the Arabic people themselves did not have issues with black people. It was something that was introduced by the European text and the European translations and the bastardization of the actual stories. Um, there, yeah, when they are describing black people, they usually use the word hideous, hideous blackamoor, and white slaves were maidens, and um, white skinned, pleasant, fine, thin, bright, as full of the moon and as glistening as the sun. And black people are hideous, disgusting, slobbering masses. It makes it difficult to feel pity for these people and to view them as human beings. And all the black people in the Arabian Nights are slaves. And all the white people, yes, they're white slaves, but they're treated better than the black slaves just based on their complexion. And this can't have been true for Arabic people. Um, I I've always believed that there's a link between the literature that was available during the industrialization of slavery and how people subsequently treated slaves as well as black people in general, even if they weren't slaves. There is the connotation that because they are black, then they are poor, they are dirty, they are hideous, they are almost animalistic savages. And they needed to do that in order to take advantage of these people who had civilizations, literature, they had their own culture and stories that were essentially taken from them, pillaged from them. And you can't do that to people and if you respect them. You can only do that if you dehumanize and disrespect them. um so all that to say, books are very powerful and have powerful cultural implications that have lasted 3 centuries and promulgated slavery. um What else? The Arabian Nights was so powerful that it was second to the Bible in terms of publication and popularity. That says a lot about how Black people were viewed during that time. Anyway, I think I've spoken for long enough. This is also another experiment to see how best to go about going live in regards to um, YouTube. So, thank you for your time and thank you for listening to me. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. And I'll be posting later today. And hopefully, you will be listening to my posts. Thank you.